does inherently any kind of interaction feel bad? Or are there ways of designing interaction that doesn't feel as bad but still gets you a deeper strategic play experience?
Distraction makers.
So land destruction,
Yes,
right? Feels bad. I think most people's solution is, well, it's just have it cost more. Like, why don't you just have it cost more, and then it feels more fair when you do that, and it's more of a trade-off, whatever. Doesn't matter. Like, if you have it cost more, people just won't play it, right?
Sure.
But no matter what, if it happens to you, there's a feeling that comes out of it that doesn't feel good.
So I could see it feeling not as bad later in the game, right? You've
yeah,
had the opportunity
because you
to
have
use
more
the mana.
because you have more land.
You have more land,
right?
Yeah.
But we're gonna get into not
why
only land
in
destruction.
particular resource destruction, resource manipulation, I guess, in Magic feels much worse than in other games.
Yes.
Cool. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit of history of land destruction, I guess.
Sure, because I don't know it.
Early on in Magic's, infancy, we had a card called Sinkhole, which cost 2 black to destroy target land. It's interesting to see the evolution, across Magic in terms of the way that they've handled land destruction. Because I think early on in the game they saw this as a thing that they were okay with. We have cards like Armageddon that destroy all lands. We have, even up into, I think, 8th edition where we had Obliterate. Was that 8th? It might be 7th edition. Somewhere in that Mirrodin 1 realm. The card Obliterate, which destroys all lands again. It's a lot more mana, but it destroys everything anyway, more than lands. Even then we had decks at that point that were venturing into land destruction territory with things like Stone Rain, which cost 3 mana, right? So like we've moved up the chain a little bit, we've moved into red, but it's still a point of interaction that Wizards was okay exploring. And now I think we're pretty firmly in the camp of land destruction is almost entirely a no-go. We get some that destroy target non-basic land because you sort of need some interaction in terms of what non-basic lands can do at this point. If you don't have that, then like you literally have no answers to some of that stuff. But yeah, it's interesting to look at this in comparison to sort of other strategy games that have the ability to affect somebody's resources, their foundational ability to play the game. Let's compare it with StarCraft for a minute.
Okay.
In StarCraft, one strategy that you can utilize is your ability to harass your opponent's means of resource gathering, right? So if you're you got your SCVs as Terran or Zerglings or whatever, they're collecting minerals. And you can send your units to go attack your opponent's mineral line.
Zerglings don't collect minerals.
What is it?
Drones.
Oh, drones. Right. Drones. Correct.
Fake fan.
I was platinum. That's bad. I only played Terran.
On Zerg?
No, Terran.
Oh, there you go.
I played Terran. I killed the Zerg, so I don't know what they do.
All of them are Zerglings.
They're just Zergs.
Yeah.
They're all Zerg.
Racist.
You know Zerg is it's in Toy Story?
Yeah, Emperor Zerg.
What the heck's up with that?
They loved StarCraft.
Is that what it was?
I don't know.
All right, whatever. So you can go harass your opponent's mineral line. And this does not feel great in terms of gameplay, but it doesn't feel nearly as bad as it does to have your land destroyed early on in Magic.
Right.
And I think part of the issue that Magic has is that it operates on very low numbers, right? We start from 1 or 0 sometimes. But let's say we start from 1. One land, you have things that cost 1. And if we're back in the early days of Magic and we're talking about Sinkhole, you can pay 2 mana to destroy one of your opponent's lands.
Right.
And this is going to happen potentially on your turn 2, your opponent's first land they play, you could blow it up. And that can deny you from playing the game at all. You can also end up in a situation where, so let's say you had 2 lands. For 1 card, I am destroying 50% of your resources.
Yeah.
Where in StarCraft, you're gathering the minerals, the mineral count is high, you're in the hundreds, and if I delay you from mining for a while, I'm stopping, maybe 100 or so production, whatever.
Right.
Depends on how long it takes you to respond to it.
You usually have like 10 SCVs if it's early in the game, maybe up to 15 SCVs, I think is like the cap. And then like your Reapers or whatever you're using to attack, like they're really only targeting like 1 to 2 SCVs at a time. Takes some time. There's some micro and some time management and stuff.
You still have the ability to recover theoretically. The only situation you could be in where you wouldn't be able to recover is if they've destroyed all your SCVs and you have no minerals to build more.
Right.
And then you lost.
It'd be like, imagine starting at Magic, but you have 10 lands at the start, and maybe you just have those 10 lands, but over time, an opponent can destroy them.
Right.
And then it's like, well, I have 9 lands, and like that's a disadvantage.
1/10 instead of 50% of your resources.
Right. Yeah. But you started with those things. Like you have those things still on your turn to go and do it, as opposed to this escalating, scaling.
And so, when we think about land destruction as an interaction point, because it affects something so foundational to your ability to play the game, and I think also works on an axis that Magic has an idiosyncrasy already, which is in that you can get mana screwed, right? You're not guaranteed to get more land.
Right.
Land destruction in particular, I think, is in this spot of being a major feel bad.
Right.
But when we look at Legacy as a format, land destruction is still pretty prevalent there because the land destruction spells are efficiently costed. So that you potentially want to play them. But something that costs 3 mana in Legacy is expensive. So you're operating at you're operating within a much more narrow window of what's playable, so that you can do a whole lot of stuff off just 1 mana. Wherein when you get into other formats and you start moving up into higher mana cost stuff, you can deny somebody the ability to even play the game if they've built their deck in a way that they can't get to those more powerful spells. Yeah. So I don't know. We look at it in terms of like looking at other pieces of interaction in Magic. Land destruction is one of the things that feels really.
It's probably
really
the
bad.
worst feeling one.
Right.
Like we talked about discarding cards. In fact, I asked people in our Discord, like what they think some of the most negative feelings are. And there's a lot of like general interaction type stuff, maybe more specific things, but I think as far as like mechanical things or things that maybe affect, resources in that way, it's usually almost always like you have to discard a card, or you're locked out. So any sort of, like stacks? Is that what it's called? Where you can't do anything?
Technically stacks, yeah.
Technically, okay. Anything like that, milling cannot feel good.
Maybe something here to discuss is the pressure that you're putting on the opponent in terms of winning the game. Like, there's a card called Avalanche Riders, which when it comes into play destroys a land, but it's also a 2/2 creature with haste, so it's moving you towards completing the game, rather than something like Stone Rain that just blows up a land and doesn't necessarily move you closer to winning the game.
And I think this was Mark Rosewater's comment on why they don't really include land destruction anymore. From what I remember, is I believe that he had commented on it saying that they don't like using land destruction because it creates a non-interactive play space. And it's essentially, in a way, it's trading a card for a card, but in trading that card for a card, right, you play a spell that destroys a land, so that's one of your cards used to destroy their land, which was one of their cards. But in doing so, you're creating that space where you didn't really play anything to the board, so it didn't progress the board state in that way. And then your opponent now is back a step. And so now they're sort of off their tempo, and they have to catch up in a way, if they can even catch up if they happen to have a land. They've mulliganed for a reason, or didn't mulligan for a particular reason. So they probably expected to have these land drops in the way that they had them. And now you're just stuck in the space where, like, okay, well, you have cards in your deck that all it does is makes your opponent not be able to do their things, but it doesn't progress the board state. And your opponent has cards, but you're destroying the things that lets them play them, meaning they can't progress the board state. So, like, how's the board state
how do we move towards the ending a game? Yeah. And I do think that's when interaction in particular feels at its worst. I think there's a lot, like, this is a spectrum though, right? Like, what types of interaction feel the best?
I also think it's
versus the worst.
I think the interesting thing to point out is that there are people that like that feeling. Right. There are people that like playing land destruction. There's people that like letting other people, like having other people discard cards. And I think that what Magic does, I think, is interesting compared to other card games, is that Magic actually embraces those those player archetypes or psychologies.
They have
right?
in the past.
I mean, they're still discard. There's still a lot of stuff like that. I think that they're more conscious of making sure that it pushes the board state, right, and progresses the game forward. And obviously they've seen that like, okay, land destruction is probably just like too much for that, and they don't really like that.
Right.
But I think that it's interesting to see, in that you can look at a lot of these other card games, especially newer card games that are coming out, and like there's no discarding of cards. There's nothing like that.
Right. Well, and even to the point where something like Lorcana, you don't even technically have to interact with your opponent to win the game.
Right.
You can just gain lore and stay on your side of the field. And yeah, sure, that like feels better, I guess. I don't know. When we talk about, I think that the thing that we really want to explore here is like, does inherently any kind of interaction feel bad? Or are there ways of designing interaction that doesn't feel as bad but still gets you a deeper strategic play experience? Because without interaction, it feels like solitaire. It feels like a race. You're just trying to get to the finish line before your opponent.
Yeah.
And so, like we can look at different types of interaction points in Magic, right? Where I think the very bottom of this is land destruction, right? That's the foundation resource of the game. But let's move one step up higher to the hand, right?
Yeah.
And if we're looking at the hand, that is directly. I think the thing that's also interesting here is that let's talk about this all in the context of, if we're looking at a card advantage, right? We're looking at 1-for-1 exchanges of cards, right? If I play a Stone Rain, I destroy one of your lands.
Right. So you used a card to get rid of someone else's card, right?
Right. Yeah. I have used one card to remove one of your cards.
Yeah.
It happens that the card that I played removes one of your lands in particular.
Yeah.
Okay, so now I can play something like Thoughtseize, which is, okay, you reveal your hand, I choose one of those cards, I remove it. If I don't even know if there's a card that exists that's 1 mana that is they just discard a card. There's probably something.
Maybe. I don't know.
Off the top of my head, I'm thinking maybe it's Cry of Contrition, might be one of them that has Haunt. I think it's 1 black. That's a deep cut from Ravnica.
Look.
I'm curious now if I'm correct. Look at that.
Is it?
Okay, yeah. There's Cry of Contrition, which is 1 black mana, target player discards a card, and then it has Haunt. So it's a little different. It's not quite 1-for-1 because you can Haunt and repeat it. Okay. But, okay, let's look at the difference between these two cards for a minute. We have Thoughtseize, which is 1-for-1 card exchange. I get to pick which card that is. So you reveal your hand. This starts moving into not like something that is a little bit beyond just 1-for-1 card exchanging. This moves into like quality
information,
advantage
known information.
too.
Yeah.
Well, it's not just that. It's that I also get to choose which card you're discarding.
Right.
So I'm able to get sort of a mana advantage potential here, where I'm like, okay, 1 black mana, and I'm going to remove one of your cards that's more powerful than the thing I just spent. Right.
Something or you throw them off tempo, so you take out the thing that they could play next turn. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so you look at that in comparison to Cry of Contrition, which is I play 1 black mana, you just get to discard whatever card you want.
Right.
Not nearly as powerful, probably doesn't feel as bad because you're also not revealing that sacred hidden information.
Right.
Okay, so we can talk about another point of interaction, which would be something like Lightning Bolt, right? 1 red mana, 3 damage to target creature or player.
Right. So
we talked previously about bolting the bird, right? Okay, your opponent plays the bird. Okay, I can use my bolt and kill it. Does that that feels different than if I played a Thoughtseize and took that bird from your hand, right? Doesn't that feel like for some reason, right? And it's probably because you've gotten closer to that card's potential in that you have gotten that card into play. And like maybe you haven't even utilized it yet. Like you haven't been able to use that mana for anything.
Yeah.
But I think that still feels better than if I had removed it with a discard spell from your hand.
Right.
It's not to say that you're going to Thoughtseize a bird, but you might. If you can see that on your opponent's next turn, they're going to want to play that bird or whatever.
Right.
On their turn 1, you Thoughtseize turn 1. You bolt the bird with your Thoughtseize.
I think it's funny because it does feel much worse, and yet that now means on your turn, you can still play another card. But with a Lightning Bolt, you've tapped your mana, committed it to the board, and then it gets removed anyways.
Right. Yeah.
So in the Thoughtseize scenario, you still get a creature on your next turn, potentially.
Yeah, if you had something else to play.
If you had something else to play. But in Lightning Bolt, whatever you committed to, that's going to be gone.
Right.
And you didn't know that.
Well, what's funny too is like the point of an interaction isn't even that much different either, because Lightning Bolt is an instant, right? So you play a Thoughtseize on your turn, right? You pass or let's say you don't play anything, you just have 1 red mana up. You pass the turn. Your opponent plays their Birds of Paradise. You bolt it on their turn, right?
Yeah.
The interaction point is almost the equivalent, right? It's just that the closer that you can get to a card's potential, the more satisfying. Like the more you feel like that card has completed its story arc, I suppose, right? Where if you don't even get the opportunity to do that, I think this is also why counterspells inherently feel worse than removal, which we talked about a little bit, and you disagree a bit.
No, I think as you become a more advanced player, I think for me it flipped.
Yeah.
As I played more. And that I felt like when something gets counterspell, I'm like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But when something gets killed, I'm like, fuck you. Like, you're going to, like, come on. Like, you're going to kill that? Come on. Come on.
Yeah. Well, and I do think that there's something here to, okay, well, a newer player playing their spell, having it on the stack and being like, okay, I'm ready to go. I'm ready for this thing to do its thing, to do the thing. I'm ready. Countered it before it even comes into play, I
do think there's some, there is some justification in that, like, if you use a kill spell, at least your ETB goes off.
Sure.
If you have haste, you could attack. Maybe you could target it with another spell.
If it was instant, you can just, if the kill spell's instant, the haste doesn't really matter.
Well, yeah. Okay, if it's an instant. But I'm just saying, like, there's more opportunity, right?
Yeah.
And technically an ETB would still go off if it's an instant kill spell.
That is true.
So I think like there is opportunity for it to still feel good. I think what's really interesting is like I think to look at it from like an overarching game design way, right? I think a lot of people look at counter spells, they looking at hand or discarding card from hands, etc., and they see it as like that doesn't feel good. Let's not put that in our game. Right? I think that's the wrong lesson to learn.
I think so too. Yeah.
And I think Hearthstone, did this in a good way. Hearthstone does not really have, I think in the first set it might have had that the Warlock class might have had stuff that has you discard cards from hand, if I'm not mistaken. Might have been in like, I think it might have been the only in the very first set. And they got rid of it. And I think that was it. Since then, they actually have their own mana destruction, but we talked about how, like, I think consecutive mana growth and having more mana and stuff kind of makes it not feel as bad having mana destruction.
Right. Yeah. If you reliably have a way to, get back on track and continue to play stuff, sure.
Right.
Yeah.
But that game overall, for the type of demographic it's going for and for the overall feel of that game, like, yeah, counterspelling feels terrible. Like, that does not feel like the right thing for that particular type of a game. I think for that style of game and that demographic, they made a good conscious decision to avoid certain types of interaction. And I think that's good and can be justified. I don't think it means every game should avoid this. And in fact, I'd be very curious to see a game that tries to take all of these ideas of land destruction or resource destruction is what we could consider it overall, and flip it and see, like, is there a way that you can make that feel like justified in a way? Right. And I feel like there is. I feel like there is a particular game, like it'd probably be a very particular type of player that would enjoy it at the same time, but I think there's a way that you can frame it that it makes it feel like, oh, that's just what this game is. That's the overall feeling you're going for.
Right, player expectation being a big deal. I think there's something interesting here that I don't know if we've actually talked about this before. Maybe we've touched on it a little bit. There's this idea of the cost of expression. And this is getting into when we're talking about using negative play patterns to create feelings in players, right? To use something to evoke a story and a narrative and to make players feel a certain way about something. And I think that is very powerful. But when we start thinking about the cost of expression, we're talking about how as a designer, when you're trying to do something that is sort of against what players might be comfortable with, there's a cost in that you might lose some players. There might be players that are not cool with it.
Yeah.
And if you're operating in an environment as a game designer where you there's a lot of other people relying on you to attract players and to keep the business going, that it's tough to get into the space where you're able to challenge players in that way. This is probably a whole other conversation that we should have at some point, but this is the problem, right? And it's something that players who have experienced some of these negative play patterns and enjoy that play style and are okay with it, I think it's something to kind of wrap our heads around, because I'm one of those players. I enjoy these types of to me, at a certain point, it all becomes card advantage. It all becomes resource exchange. And like, don't get me wrong, land destruction, it feels bad, but there's ways to build, around what's possible in an environment. But, as players who have experienced some metagames like this and have played the game a really long time, I think something that we just sort of need to wrap our heads around is that designers do have a responsibility, and part of that responsibility is to grow the company. It's tough. When a game is not as big, I think it's easier to explore some of this territory. And as a game grows, it becomes more difficult.
Yeah.
Well, it's ways to think about. Like, again, I think one of the important lessons and a takeaway here, if you're thinking about putting these kinds of interactions in your game, one is to think about the actual impact that it has, right? If you have a resource system where one individual resource being destroyed is a huge deal, maybe don't do that. Also, you should think about, I think the idea of a card reaching its potential before it is interacted with, I think is something that also is a good lesson to take away here. Is that it's not to say that like that always should be the case, but when it's not the case, that's when you're starting to move into territory of players potentially being not cool with this kind of interaction.
I think in tandem with that, the thing that makes it feel extra bad, and this is actually, I think, a big learning curve for new players of any trading card game. I know going back into Magic and then playing other like stuff like Artifact is when I kind of remembered like this is a thing. Is that understanding a possibility space of what your opponent can do is something that is very difficult for people to get. And I think what is really overwhelming for new TCG players. Magic, I think, does a very good job at it. Much better than I think people give it credit for, because I don't think most people consider this. But what I mean by like possibility space is like knowing, okay, my opponent has 2 untapped blue, they could counterspell, like for sure. If they have it, that's the possibility of what they could do. So when they do it, because I can expect it, because I'm familiar enough with the game, it doesn't feel as bad. I think, though, when you're unfamiliar with the game and these things are like a learning curve for you to get over, it can feel really terrible. And I think it especially becomes difficult, and I think a lot of TCGs can kind of have this problem where there's not a clearly identified like psychology or pattern or philosophy of its colors, or, whatever its factions, whatever it is. That this is actually my problem with some like really crunchy mechanical games, something like Digimon, is that a lot of the times it didn't feel quite clear. There's not a lot of crossover turn interaction, but like it feels very much like a lot of these colors are doing the same thing, but in a slightly different way, not its own completely unique thing. And so when a color is able to do something, I go, oh, okay, well, I didn't know blue could do that or whatever. And I kind of feel like cheated out and like not able to expect how a certain play pattern might come from that type of a deck or something.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, especially in terms of like information chunking, right? Like flavor is one way you can help players chunk information. It's not the only thing flavor does, but is one thing that if you're someone who is looking at a game from a purely mechanical perspective, this is something that you need to understand about that flavor does for you, is that understanding how to communicate non-verbally with your players is extremely important.